folks, so as a reminder, we are finishing up stress and health. I am recording this for you right now to basically finish up what we didn't cover in class. So hopefully this won't take up too much of your time. This section in general is pretty straightforward and pretty easy to understand. So the last time that we were here, which was earlier today in class, we talked about the fact that in general, stress is going to trigger our sympathetic nervous system. And at that point, that fight or flight response becomes engaged. So we're going to see a variety of different effects. So first of all, our amygdala is potentially going to register a threat. The amygdala has a lot of connections with both the hypothalamus as well as the pituitary, which will exert their effects on the sympathetic nervous system. So we'll see things like our heart rate increasing, our lungs ventilating faster, digestion will shut down, epinephrine and norepinephrine will be released by the adrenal gland, our muscles will tense, and our arteries will widen so that more oxygen-rich blood can get through to mobilize our resources. So Hans Selye basically, as I mentioned, described what happens in rats as well as with people with what he termed the general adaptation syndrome. So this is the general body's response to stress. First, we have the alarm reaction where the stress is registered and the sympathetic nervous system is triggered. After that comes resistance, where our body's responses remain heightened because we are still mobilizing energy to fight that stress. And then finally, we have exhaustion. So we need a period after the stress is over where our resources are depleted and we need to basically regroup that energy. And so rest and recovery after a period of stress is going to be essential. It's part of the reason why with any type of workout that you do, one of the most important things that you can do is recover. It's how you build back your resources. So when you lift weights, you are creating little micro tears in your muscles. You need recovery so that those muscles can repair themselves and become stronger. So recovery is a critical part of the process of recovering from stress. And one of the things that we find with stress is that there are many different ways to cope with stress. Now, some people during stressful periods tend to withdraw, and this is not a bad idea. It conserves your energy. And it helps you kind of manage your energy to deal with things when you're ready to deal with them. The problem is that by withdrawing, we can potentially end up in a paralysis type situation where we are afraid to deal with any sort of stress or deal with any situation that is stressful. On the other hand, we can also seek out and provide support. So we may turn to friends, and this is what is referred to as a tend and befriend response. So oftentimes in a stressful period, we may nurture our relationships, we may spend more time with our social support system, and we may try to rely on our social support to basically get us through those instances. Now, I want to talk a bit about psychoneuroimmunology. So it is something that's going to come up on the test. Stress has an effect on our health. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, your body is basically not an infinite energy generator. The energy that you have to keep your body running and all of its systems is finite. That means that if energy is being diverted to fight stress, it has to be taken away from somewhere else. And so one of the things that we know is that in general, stress diverts energy from our immune system. And what that means is that under periods of stress, your body is not as capable of fighting different types of intruders. So when we look at how psychological states like stress affect the immune system, we are basically working in a field called psychoneuroimmunology. So basically, psychoneuroimmunology psychoneuroimmunology is a field of study that looks at the relationship between our psychological states, our neural processes, and our endocrine system processes. So that includes things like our glands, to basically combine to affect our immune system and our health. So we're looking at how our nervous system and our psychological states affect immunity and our ability to fight intruders coming in. So if we talk a little bit about how our system normally handles intruders, it's a pretty complex system, and you can see why energy would be involved there. So your book, if you go to figure 10.4, they actually have a really good look at these. So for bacterial infections or cancer cells, oftentimes we are going to deal with B lymphocytes. So we call them B lymphocytes because the B stands for bone marrow, where these cells are derived. So generally, B lymphocytes are there to fight bacterial infections. Now, what about something like cancer or a virus? So cancer is a natural mutation in cells. And generally, especially when you're younger, your immune system is capable of killing those mutations. So we have T lymphocytes, which are basically created in the thymus gland. And so when you hear about T cells, that's what they're talking about. So T lymphocytes basically attack cancer cells, they attack viruses, they attack other types of foreign substances like dust or pollen or things like that. We also have what are called microphages and macrophages. These are basically designed to attack harmful invaders, and additionally digest debris and worn out or dead cells. So when you think about a microphage or a macrophage, I want you to think kind of like Pac-Man, because phage literally translates to eating. So a macrophage is a big eater, a microphage is a small eater, and they go nom, 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 nom. And then finally, we also have what are called natural killer cells or NK cells. Those attack diseased cells as well. So this is how our immune system normally handles intruders, but for these to be able to be produced, they require a lot of energy. And what we find in general is that stress dampens our immune response. So when we are fighting stress, we're going to take all that energy that we would otherwise be using to create lymphocytes and NK cells and macrophages. And we're basically taking that all into our sympathetic nervous system to fight that stress. So generally, what we are going to see, first of all, it's pretty well documented that for a lot of people that deal with stress, so here we have a psychological stress index. Higher numbers mean higher periods of stress. And generally, what we tend to find is that the more stressed you are, the more likely it is that you're going to get a cold. So here's what we know. In general, research has found, and this is in your textbook, that surgical wounds tend to heal more slowly in people who are stressed. Generally, if you're stressed, you're going to develop colds more easily. And then additionally, stress can actually speed the course of different types of diseases, including things like AIDS, HIV, and cancer. Now, I want to be really clear about something. Stress does not cause AIDS. Stress does not cause cancer, but stress can actually enhance the decline that happens due to these things. So one thing that I will kind of mention particularly about stress and cancer is that researchers did actually find a stress cancer link in rodents. So researchers basically implanted tumor cells in rodents, or they exposed them to carcinogens. And then they would expose the rodents to uncontrollable stress. They list like a lot of inescapable shocks or loud bursts of white noise. And basically what they found is that for the rats that were stressed, they developed cancer more often, their tumor growth was faster, and the tumors tended to be larger when they grew. So in rodents, Stress actually enhances the speed with which cancer grows, and in some cases causes cancer. But we do tend to find that generally people are at increased risk of cancer after a period of stress. But in general, stress does not cause cancer. The research on the relationship to stress and cancer is very, very mixed. So stress may affect the growth of cancer cells by basically weakening the immune system, but generally stress doesn't cause cancer. And so one thing that I will mention is that you might ask yourself, well, if I manage my stress, will this potentially slow the growth of cancer? And unfortunately, the answer is no. But what it will do is it will enhance your quality of life, particularly if you are struggling with depression after getting a cancer diagnosis. So stress doesn't cause cancer, and unfortunately, managing stress doesn't necessarily slow the growth of cancer, but it does improve your quality of life and feeling like you have a better quality of life. Now, there is one disease that is strongly linked to stress, and that is coronary heart disease. And part of the reason for this is that in general, when you are stressed, the blood vessels will begin to close over time. So heart disease basically occurs when the blood vessels that gradually close over time. So high blood pressure, family history, all of these things are factors. In addition to this, smoking, obesity, unhealthy diet, not being physically active, and high cholesterol all play a role in coronary heart disease, but so does stress. So here's what we know. Generally, stress leads to inflammation in the body. And we know that increased inflammation leads to increased health problems, increased heart problems. So what's actually kind of interesting is that depression is also linked to heart disease because the stress that depression causes and the inflammation that depression causes actually is more likely to damage the heart as a result. So here's what's kind of interesting. Stress really plays a role. This is interesting. So in a really famous study back in 1984, Friedman and Ulmer basically looked at 40 tax accountants during stressful and unstressful times of the year. And so a stressful time of the year is usually from January to about April, basically around April 15th, which is when most tax returns are due. And then an unstressful period, that may be May or June or even January before most people get their W-2s. And what the researchers actually found is that on unstressful periods, heart health was pretty normal, but during the stressful tax season, cholesterol rose to poor levels, clotting measures rose to poor levels, so that increases heart attack risk. Once the stressful period was over, the clotting factors and the cholesterol actually ended up returning to normal. Turns out that when it comes to cardiovascular health, your personality type also really matters. Researchers have basically occasionally tried to distinguish between two different types of people, what we would call a type A personality and a type B personality. Now, Dr. Gilchrist would definitely fit a type A personality. Generally, people with type A personalities, they're pretty competitive, they're very driven, they're very impatient, they're time conscious, they're motivated, and they're very easily angered. So there's this undercurrent of anger. Now compare that to somebody with something like a type B personality. These people tend to be pretty easygoing and relaxed. So researchers were trying to figure out what is it about type A personalities, because it's pretty well documented that type A personalities have a higher heart attack risk. Now, why is that? Is it because they're impatient? Is it because they're competitive? No, it's the negative emotions, particularly that undercurrent of anger, that really affects the likelihood of developing a heart attack. Now, part of the reason about this is that generally, if you're type A and you're dealing with a stressor, you get aggressive. The sympathetic nervous system is going to get kicked off. And because of that, you are potentially going to have excess cholesterol because when you're stressed, your liver can't filter out that cholesterol. And additionally, that cholesterol and that fat that your liver would normally take care of are going to be deposited around the heart. That's going to alter blood flow, and that's going to, over the long term, alter heart rhythm. So if you're a type A person in general, you want to try as much as possible to manage your negative emotions in a healthy way. Suppressing negative emotions often tends to affect us far worse. So we need to find a healthy way to deal with our anger, just as we talked about in the previous section. So how do we cope? I hate to break it to you, but none of us is going to be able to live a life without stress. So there are two major ways that we can really choose to manage our stress. So one of the things that we can do is what is called problem-focused coping. So we try to reduce our stress by directly changing what is causing us stress. So we're going to directly try to change the stressor ourselves. So if you had a fight with a friend and that fight and the aftermath of that fight is causing you stress, a way that you can engage in problem-focused coping is you can go talk to your friend and hopefully hash it out. But let's be very clear. Sometimes we can't change things, or we believe that we can't change things. In those particular cases, we may want to engage in emotion-focused coping. So this is when we kind of try to manage the emotions that we feel rather than directly trying to fix the problem itself. Now, there are certain instances where it's probably more valuable to fix the problem. But having said that, there are certain things that just buckling down and trying to fix the problem and working harder, there are some things that you can never fix. There are certain things you do not have control over, and as a result, emotion-focused coping can be a way to manage that. Now, that's not to say that emotion-focused coping doesn't have its downside. What we know is that some things you can absolutely change. So there are some things you can absolutely change. But if you use emotion-focused coping in lieu of directly trying to change the problem, you may be setting yourself up to fail. So if you know that a way to get better on a test is to study, but you choose to manage your stress about the test by watching Netflix instead, that's actually hurting your ability to directly change the stressor yourself. So we know that there are some different factors that affect how well we cope with stress. So let's talk about those now. So one of the first things that really seems to play a role in how we manage our stress is how much control we actually have over our environment. So research has actually found that if we feel like we don't have a lot of control over the environment, or if we actually don't have any control over the environment, we are going to develop what is referred to as learned helplessness. So there's a very famous study. So learned helplessness was originally studied by Martin Seligman with dogs. Now, this is a case where you could not do this study today. Seligman actually exposed a group of dogs to inescapable electrical shocks. And there was nothing that the dogs could do to escape the shocks. And then after a while, after being exposed to this uncontrollable stress, Seligman actually gave the dogs an opportunity to escape. And basically what they found is that the dogs would not leave. They basically laid on the floor of the cage that they were in, or the box that they were in, and they basically just laid on the floor and cried. So basically, in contrast, dogs that had actually learned to escape, The first shocks basically were readily able to escape shocks. So it seems like what happens in our environment ultimately matters. If you feel hopeless, or that you do not control your environment, or if you've been exposed to a lot of stress that you had no control over, we know that this can cause stress, and for many people it can actually trigger health problems. We know that depression, for example, is often accompanied by a sense of learned helplessness. We know that our health can suffer as a result. We'll get more stress hormones coursing throughout our bodies. This will hurt blood pressure. It'll hurt our immune response. And generally what we know is that if we feel like we have a sense of control over our environment, this ultimately improves our health and it improves our outlook on life. So this is kind of related to something that is referred to, as a locus of control. So do you believe that the things that happen to you are largely in your control, or do you believe that they're not? So a locus of control is basically, is what happens to you due to your efforts, or is it due to luck, fate, chance, or something like that? So somebody that has an external locus of control is going to believe that outside forces basically control their fate. Somebody with an internal locus of control believes that they control their fate. Now, let's be completely honest. It's never purely one or the other. There are things that are within our control and things that are outside our control. But most of us tend to default to one position or another. And in general, we find that having an internal locus of control generally they are going to have better health, they feel less depressed, and they do tend to achieve more. Research has also suggested that self-control may also help with stress. Our ability to basically control our impulses and delay our gratifications can lead to better health as well. Now let's be clear, self-control requires a lot of work. It requires attention, it requires energy, but generally it does work like a muscle. The more that you practice with it, the stronger it becomes. So you can learn to manage your anger or not react immediately or emotionally to something that somebody says. Another thing that we know affects our ability to cope is whether you are an optimist or you are a pessimist. And in general, we find that people who have more of an optimistic outlook on life tend to handle stress better, they tend to be less sick, and they do report greater longevity. They generally cope with stress much better as well because they believe that things will generally work out for the best. Generally, for a pessimist, this is obviously not the case. They expect things to go badly, and that ends up making them feel worse. Now, having said all the positives about optimism, it is important to have a sense of realism under certain circumstances. Realism can be helpful because it helps us prepare for potential challenges, obstacles, or risks that we are taking. But one thing is very clear, one of the major things that really helps us cope is social support. Generally, feeling liked or appreciated by others helps us cope, and this is even true if all that you have is a pet. We find that even having a pet can actually lower your blood pressure. So research has found, and this actually is in your book, having a pet increases the odds of survival after a heart attack, it relieves depression among people with AIDS, and it lowers blood pressure and other risk factors. Now, pets aren't necessarily going to be a substitute for taking better care of your health, but they do provide a lot of benefit. And we know that social support has a lot of positive effects on the body and on the immune system. So Cohen and colleagues basically had women that were married. Basically, they were lying in an fMRI, and they had a slight electrical shock to the ankle. Nothing painful, nothing dangerous, just a little bit uncomfortable. Now, during the experiment, some women got to hold the hand of their husband. On the other hand, they got to either hold a stranger's hand or no stranger, period. So that's kind of our control group. And those who actually held the hand of somebody that they cared about, they tended to have less brain activity in threat responsive areas. And this benefit was going to be the largest for people that were in those best quality marriages. So social support really seems to help us manage stress and reduce the feeling of threat that we feel. Additionally, with social support, we get an opportunity to confide and find meaning in our lives because we are important and beneficial to the people around us. So now we're going to talk about different things that you can do to manage your stressful feelings. So one of the first things that I would recommend, and this is something I very much believe in, is that exercise is a fantastic stress reliever. And that's partially because aerobic exercise in particular increases your cardiovascular fitness. And this is generally good for you. Research has actually found that aerobic exercise can actually help manage feelings of depression. So what you're looking at here is data from a study looking at college students who were depressed. So we have a group that got aerobic exercise, another group that got relaxation treatment, and a group that got no treatment. And while groups that either got relaxation or exercise ultimately showed a decline in their depression, that was especially true for groups that engaged in aerobic exercise. And this is a causal link. All of these students had depression at the beginning of the study, and generally they were all pretty similar in their scores. Now, am I telling you that the only way to treat depression is with exercise? No. For many people, medication can absolutely be useful and provide benefit. But what I am saying is that managing your stress and managing your depression should be a multi-pronged process. Ideally, in a perfect world, you have somebody that you're talking to, be it a counselor, a therapist, or a trusted friend. If you need it, there is medication. And additionally, you're engaging in healthy behaviors that are good for your body and are good for your mind. We also know that relaxation and meditation can be very useful. We know that relaxation, progressive relaxation, where we progressively relax different body parts, relieves a lot of health symptoms, and particularly if you are a type A person that has had a heart attack in the past, we do actually know that modifying your lifestyle by including relaxation techniques can actually reduce the risk of another heart attack after you've had the first one. And this goes above and beyond eating better food and making healthier food choices. We also know that meditation helps for similar reasons to relaxation. And then finally, research has found that for those who are religious or have some type of spirituality, that there is a greater life expectancy. And so why is religious attendance particularly associated with less stress? Is it because depending on the religion or the faith that you're in, you have different dietary guidelines to support a healthier lifestyle? Is it because you are surrounded by like-minded believers? In general, that doesn't seem to be what a lot of the research suggests. Rather, religion encourages a lot of the relaxation techniques that we've already kind of talked about, as well as many of the coping factors that we've mentioned. In general, this is certainly not true for all religions or all faiths, but some faiths have a greater sense of hopefulness and acceptance, and they tend to promote a pretty stable worldview. So these things happen because of this particular higher power. Additionally, a variety of religions also encourage meditation and prayer, which are very similar to relaxation techniques. Frankly, I think it's more important to have the social support you need and to find meaning in life and in what you believe in, even if that belief is that there's nothing there. And so I think it's important to believe in something even if it's nothing. So this is pretty much all I had for you. Hopefully this will help you prepare for the test. This particular portion is not super rigorous in terms of content, so you ought to be okay. But I will see you on Wednesday for the exam. Don't forget to watch the review session, and I wish you the best of luck. Bye.